Why did Donald Trump get it right and Kamala Harris get it so wrong? Hi everybody, I'm Niall Paterson, and that is what we are asking on The Daily after Donald Trump swept to a second historic victory in the US presidential elections.
I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president. This will truly be the golden age of America. That's what we have to have. This is a magnificent victory for the American people that will allow us to make America great again.
Now, many of you will have noticed that every day this week we have already been reporting from the United States, and you can catch up with all our episodes, including the story of the night where you found this one. But today we just wanted to let the team have a little bit of sleep whilst we examine exactly what happened. And, as perhaps the most pertinent question of the night, why didn't the polls predict it once again? Chris Jackson is from the polling company Ipsos, and he joins us now. Chris, I was told that this was going to be the tightest race of all time. I was looking at polls that said it was 50-50 all the way to the end. Why then did Donald Trump win such a resounding victory, do you think?
Well, one, we don't actually know what the final tally is. There's still about 20% of the vote remaining to be counted in the country, and a lot of that vote is out of Democratic areas. So the margins are likely going to close up a little bit. Not enough, of course, to change the outcome of the election. It does look like Trump it has won something like a clean sweep of the battleground states. But I think that actually does line up with where the pre-election polling was, which did suggest all of these states were a toss-up. And the likelihood is if they all moved in a direction, they'd probably move in the same direction. So, you know, the difference between a 50-50 election and something that looks like a clean sweep is only 1% or 2% of the vote. And that seems to be sort of what we're seeing now. And I think it's just important to remember that, you know, Trump looks like he's likely going to end up with 50, maybe 51% of the popular vote. That isn't necessarily a resounding victory. It is certainly for modern American politics, which are so closely divided, but it's not like, you know, he's got some super majority of the population voting for him. It still is actually a narrow victory. It just so happens that he has just enough votes in just the right states to have a larger electoral college margin.
But to the victor, the spoils, and it's not just the keys to the White House, is it? He's got the Supreme Court in his back pocket, he's got the House of Representatives, and he now has the Senate. I mean, I'm putting you on the spot here, Chris, but how did he do it?
So the House is yet to be called. Still too early on that one, though it does look like it's probably going to follow him and Republicans are going to take it. Republicans definitely have taken control of the Senate. With that, it means that they'll have the ability, as you say, to nominate and confirm Supreme Court justices, which already has a conservative supermajority. I think there's a number of reasons why it sort of played out this way, but the biggest one is that the American people remain very unhappy about the state of the economy, remain very unhappy about cost and inflation, driving up costs, and blamed Biden and Harris to some extent for that, whether fairly or not. And Trump was able to take advantage of that, and that's what he was really able to ride to the White House.
In terms, though, of the financial situation that many, many Americans find themselves in right now, I mean, that old mantra, it's the economy, stupid. Is it always, when it comes to US presidential elections, ultimately about cash in the back pocket and the feeling of whether or not their life has improved over the course of the previous presidency?
You know, the macroeconomic signals in the United States have been moving in a positive direction for most of this year. But the reality is that the cost of regular household items is still up 20% over when Biden took office. And that's the reality that Americans are confronting that, again, helped sort of fuel Trump's position. And I think the other thing that's just worth noting is, at least in the returns we've seen so far, it looks like it's a smaller electorate this year than in 2020. And the difference isn't necessarily that Trump has won gobs of new voters. It's that Harris doesn't seem like she's been able to hold on to Biden's electorate, which, again, I think is a characteristic of a base that's a little bit demoralized, a little bit less engaged. And just, Harris's closing arguments just were unable to get them over the hump to show up on Election Day.
Yeah, I mean, my reading of it is that Kamala Harris has gone backwards on numbers that Joe Biden had in every state. Is that in any way surprising when you consider, this was in the incumbent party at a time where you've got a tanking economy, stagnating wages, rising prices that you've just mentioned there? I mean, is it possible to say that Kamala Harris did perhaps better than she should have done given the economic backdrop?
I think Harris ran a very good campaign. It's hard to imagine anything that she would have done differently that really would have made a material difference on the outcome. She was only the candidate for about 3 months. But yeah, I think that the backdrop is that Americans are unhappy, and Biden's approval rating remains stuck around 40%. Even after he announced he no longer was running, it never really improved. And I think that, again, is the headwinds Harris was always running against. And without the sort of some of the advantages of the incumbency, it turns out like it was too much of a headwind for her to overcome.
I mean, you mentioned Joe Biden there. I wonder if the problems regarding President Biden are perhaps twofold. One, and many commentators have already suggested this, Kamala Harris did not distance herself enough from the Joe Biden presidency. She was vice president, so perhaps there's an obvious reason for that. But did Joe Biden also, on top of that, just give her insufficient time to be able to beat Donald Trump?
This short schedule for Harris and for the Democrats certainly made it a little bit harder for them. But I do think that the key factor is that sort of just unhappiness. And for Democrats, I think there was a challenge because about half of the Democratic Party was very favorable towards Joe Biden, liked what he was doing, liked the policies he put in place. So Harris couldn't run away from them too far or risk alienating that group of people. But then the other half of the Democratic coalition who doesn't follow the news as closely, isn't as engaged in sort of the battles over policy and social issues, were just worried about their pocketbook. And that's the group that it seems like Harris struggled to really mobilize and bring back into the fold. And that's the group that it seems like she may have come up short with.
Kamala Harris campaigned very, very strongly on abortion. I've lost count of the number of times I heard from Democrats that this was going to be the reproductive rights election. And it just wasn't, was it?
Well, it's interesting because it seems like Donald Trump has been able to sort of de-link himself from abortion and from essentially Roe v. Wade, the national decision that made abortion legal across the country, being overturned by the Supreme Court justices he put into power. So, for instance, we saw in Florida, Trump expanded his margins. He won the state by 11 or 12%. I haven't checked this morning to see what the numbers are, but by a substantial margin, much larger than he won in 2020. And yet 58% of the people in the state voted for the abortion ballot measure in the state, which unfortunately isn't going to pass because it needs 60% in the state. But we have this weird thing happening where Americans are voting both in favor of abortion, but also in favor of Trump. And there seems to be a substantial chunk of Americans who somehow have managed to deal with this cognitive dissonance of, oh yeah, I'll vote for Trump, but I'm also going to vote for abortion, not necessarily believing or understanding that it is very easy for a Republican-dominated legislature and a Trump White House to sign a national ban on abortion that would overturn all of these state rulings.
Is there perhaps a parallel then in the way that the Republicans and Donald Trump managed to weaponize immigration as an issue at this election? I mean, the Democrats have long thought that they have Black Americans, Latino Americans in the bag. But we know from our own journalism over in the United States, there are plenty of people, particularly in the Latino community, first and second generation, who look at the way in which illegal migration is happening in the United States, and they're as incensed about it as anyone else.
Yeah, I think immigration certainly has not hurt Trump. If anything, it has given him some running on immigration has given him some strong talking points. And it's an issue that I think Democrats thought was going to be more helpful for them than ended up being. And we've seen that in the returns to date is that Harris seems to be doing particularly bad compared to Biden in heavily Hispanic areas, suggesting that she's lost a substantial chunk of the Hispanic vote. Now, it's, again, too early to say, did Trump win Hispanic voters? I don't think he did, but he certainly cut the margin that Democrats enjoyed down a lot. And I think that, speaks to the reality that Hispanic voters are people who are, if they're immigrants who have been naturalized, become citizens so that they can vote, or they're second, third generation, as you mentioned, and they're just not as motivated by some of these issues with immigration. And as you say, are concerned about much more bread and butter issues, particularly the economy, which does seem to be sort of the driving concern with Latino voters, as well as crime, security, these sort of issues, which Trump, I think, was successful at tying immigration to.
If success in a presidential election was based entirely on the celebrities you can attract to your campaign, this would have been Kamala Harris's from the get-go. And I think back to 2016 when Donald Trump also won, and the celebrities that were rolled out at that point. Do these big names, these big faces, these popular figures from popular culture, do they have no effect on elections like this?
They seem to have pretty minimal effect, and Democrats have been winning sort of the celebrity endorsement contest for a long time. That's not a new phenomenon, but I think for most Americans, they're able to sort of separate out how or what sort of what their sort of figure they like in pop culture or what have you says versus what they're going to do on their own. And we're even seeing, things like newspaper endorsements, of which there were fewer this year, also don't seem to matter. I think Americans increasingly are being driven by sort of personal factors, idiosyncratic factors, or how people in their community, their immediate social network are behaving, much more than sort of relying on any other person to sort of give them guidance, except for perhaps, Donald Trump himself.
Isn't it arguable, though, that Donald Trump did benefit from the celebrity phenomenon in the shape of, one of the world's most listened to podcasters, Joe Rogan, and one of the world's richest and, I'll describe him charitably, interesting men, Elon Musk?
I'm skeptical that the Rogan podcast did much for Trump. Again, it's too early to say. I think it would just maybe added a little bit of extra oomph with a group he was already sort of doing relatively well with, which is young men. I think the Musk phenomenon, though, that matters because Musk has radically changed how X, formerly Twitter, operates, and that served as a vehicle to inject a lot of noise into the system. And I think that's one of the things we see in our survey data is all of the positive information about the economy, the U.S. stock market hitting record highs, inflation returning back to sort of average levels, strong job growth. Most Americans aren't aware of those facts. Most Americans don't know that they happened. But when you talk about the bad stuff, right, any sort of negative news, that everyone sort of knows about. And I think that's been some of the Musk effect. That's been some of the effect of having sort of a very cohesive conservative media system where they're able to be very disciplined about pushing out these information, these pieces of news that helped Trump ultimately and sort of making sure that when people learned things, they learned things that were in his favor.
Wasn't the writing on the wall for this election written back in 2016? When, again, you had an establishment Washington figure who also happened to be a woman going up against a populist, and of course in the shape of Hillary Clinton. Fast forward to this year, and on top of that, as top of being a Washington woman and a person of colour, another kind of technocrat, arguably, going up against the populist Donald Trump. I mean, wasn't that fundamentally one of the biggest mistakes the Democrats made?
I think any Democrat in this environment would have struggled. I really think the writing was on the wall in late 2021 when inflation started spiking after the pandemic and all the supply chain issues that happened. I think in this environment, Barack Obama, if he'd been the nominee, would have struggled to win. It's hard to see in an environment where Democrats seemed to be somewhat demoralized, particularly sort of the more marginal Democratic voters, people who aren't as closely tied to the news cycles or the party, it was going to be difficult to get them to show up and vote absent some sort of miraculous change in economic fortunes. And I just, there was nothing that Harris could do to deliver that, right? The president doesn't actually have that much power over the economy. So I think it was really more about 2021 and that surge in inflation the country dealt with, like everyone around the world. And that really set Trump up for this victory ultimately.
But is the United States, in your opinion, ready for a female president?
I mean, it certainly seems like we're not ready for a female president this election cycle. I think it's an open question. I think For instance, in 2008, when Barack Obama ran against John McCain at the beginning of the Great Recession, I think probably any Democrat could have won that race. So if Hillary Clinton had actually won the primary versus instead of Obama, she probably could have won the White House then. I think a lot of this is a lot more structural than it is personality. And it just seems that in 2016, after 2 terms of Democrats, in 2024, after another term of a Democrat and this huge inflationary surge, people just weren't in the mood for it.
Chris, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Great to have you on the podcast.
Good to be with you.
And that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. Do remember, plenty more coverage from the United States is available on the website, and you can also hear many podcasts from our team across the Atlantic as well. Just look where you found this one. We'll see you again tomorrow.